Picture this. You're walking through Sydney International Airport after a 14-hour flight. Before you can collect your luggage, a detector dog sits next to your bag. A biosecurity officer politely asks if you've brought any food items. You forgot about the apple in your carry-on. That'll be a $420 fine. Now imagine landing in Los Angeles. You grab your bag and walk straight out. No agricultural inspection. No questions. Two different philosophies. Two different outcomes. What if I told you there's a Western democracy where gun laws are stricter, yet people report feeling safer? Where healthcare is universal, yet emergency wait times often beat major U.S. cities? Where voting is mandatory, yet citizens don't protest it as oppression? I'm talking about Australia. And in the next 8 minutes, we're going to examine 6 specific policy approaches where Australia has managed to balance individual freedom with collective safety, and what the data actually shows about the outcomes. If you're interested in understanding how different democracies solve complex problems, subscribe now. We analyze global policy approaches every week, and this comparison will challenge some common assumptions you might have about freedom, safety, and what's possible. Let's start with the most controversial example. April 28, 1996. Port Arthur, Tasmania. A gunman opened fire at a popular tourist site, killing 35 people in what became Australia's deadliest mass shooting. The weapon? A semi-automatic rifle purchased legally just weeks earlier. Within 12 days, Australia's newly elected Prime Minister John Howard, a conservative, announced the National Firearms Agreement. The response was swift and, surprisingly, bipartisan. The government offered to buy back semi-automatic and pump-action shotguns. Over the next year, Australians turned in 650,000 firearms. The government paid market value, about $500 million. Here's what happened next. A University of Sydney study published in 2021 analyzed the 25 years following the reform. Firearm homicides dropped 50%. Suicides involving guns fell 57%. And here's the statistic that stands out. Australia hasn't experienced a mass shooting, defined as 5 or more deaths, in over 27 years since Port Arthur. Now, let's be clear about what this policy actually is. Gun ownership in Australia isn't zero. There are still 3.5 million registered firearms in the country. You can own guns for farming, sport shooting, collecting. But the process changed dramatically. You need a genuine reason self-defense doesn't qualify. You need licensing with safety training. And storage requirements are strict. Guns and ammunition must be kept separately in approved safes. The contrast with the United States is stark, but it's important to understand the scale. America has approximately 393 million civilian-owned firearms. The cultural contexts are entirely different. Australia is an island nation with no land borders. The U.S. has a constitutional amendment specifically protecting gun rights, and a founding mythology deeply connected to armed self-reliance. But here's what Australia's example demonstrates. When political will exists, categorical restrictions combined with compensation-based buyback programs can achieve public safety goals while still allowing ownership for specific purposes. The key was speed, acting while public support was overwhelming, and fairness, paying market rates so gun owners didn't feel punished. The question isn't, would this work in America? The histories are too different. The question is, what does swift, bipartisan action after tragedy actually look like? But gun policy is just one area where Australia prioritizes collective safety. The next example might surprise you because it involves something most of us do without thinking, or in many cases not doing at all. Australia has required citizens to vote since 1924. If you're enrolled and you don't show up to cast a ballot, you receive a fine. Currently, it's about $20. Pay it, and that's the end of it. Refuse, and it can escalate, but prosecutions are extremely rare. Here's what most people don't realize. Mandatory voting fundamentally changes political incentive structures. In the U.S., between 35 to 40% of eligible voters don't participate in presidential elections. That number jumps to 50 to 60% for midterms. This creates a strategic landscape where winning means energizing your base more than appealing to the middle. Voter suppression becomes a tactic. Extreme messaging mobilizes committed supporters while everyone else stays home. Australia's participation rate sits between 91 to 96%. When everyone has to show up, politicians can't win by cherry-picking enthusiastic supporters or suppressing opposition turnout. They have to appeal to the median voter, the teacher, the plumber, the office worker who just wants competent governance. Sarah Cameron, a political scientist at the University of Melbourne, published research in 2022 examining this effect. Her finding: mandatory voting creates accountability to the median voter, not just party activists. It reduces the electoral advantage of extreme positions because politicians must win over people who aren't ideologically committed. You can see this in policy outcomes. Australian politics has its share of heated debates and partisan divisions. But on fundamental issues, universal healthcare, workplace protections, gun regulations, there's been remarkable consistency across different governments. Why? Because when everyone votes, dismantling popular programs becomes electoral suicide. Now, is this a restriction on freedom? Technically, yes. You're required to show up to a polling place or request an absentee ballot. But here's the nuance. You're not required to vote for anyone. You can submit a blank ballot. You can write none of the above. The law requires participation in the process, not endorsement of a candidate. And the data suggests most Australians don't see it as oppressive. Polling consistently shows 70 to 75% support for maintaining compulsory voting. Why? Because high participation creates a political culture where governments are accountable to everyone, not just the loudest voices. This democratic participation extends beyond voting into an area that directly affects daily life, how healthcare access is structured. Let's talk about what happens when you need medical care in Australia versus the United States. In Sydney, if you walk into an emergency department with chest pain, you'll be triaged immediately. If it's serious, you'll be treated right away. No paperwork about insurance. No upfront payment. Your Medicare card, issued to all citizens and permanent residents, covers it. The bill goes to the government. Now, Australia's healthcare system isn't what many Americans imagine when they hear universal healthcare. It's actually a mixed model. Medicare provides free or subsidized care through public hospitals and for visits to general practitioners. But roughly 47% of Australians also carry private health insurance. Why? Private insurance gets you faster access to elective procedures, choice of specialist, and private hospital rooms. Here's the data comparison. The Commonwealth Fund published a comprehensive study in 2023 ranking healthcare systems across 11 developed nations. Australia ranked 5th overall. The United States ranked 11th. Now consider the cost. Australia spends approximately $6,000 per person annually on healthcare. The US spends $12,900. More than double. Yet life expectancy in Australia is 83.3 years compared to 78.9 in America. Let's be honest about the trade-offs. In Australia's public system, wait times for elective surgeries can be longer. If you need a hip replacement and it's not urgent, you might wait months. If you want it faster, you can use private insurance or pay out of pocket. But emergency care is prioritized universally. A heart attack or stroke. You're treated immediately, regardless of insurance status. The Australian model shows something important. Universal coverage doesn't eliminate private healthcare. It creates a foundation while allowing people to purchase additional services. The government negotiates drug prices. Australia's pharmaceutical benefits scheme means common medications cost $7 to $40 instead of hundreds. But you can still buy insurance for extra coverage. Critics in Australia argue the system is underfunded, that public hospital wait times are too long. These are real concerns. But here's what doesn't happen. Medical bankruptcy. A 2019 American Journal of Public Health study found that 66.5% of U.S. bankruptcies involved medical issues. In Australia, medical debt as a cause of financial ruin is virtually non-existent. The insight here isn't Australia's system is perfect. It's that universal baseline access with optional private upgrades is a viable model that produces better population health outcomes at half the cost. Healthcare access is one form of safety net, but Australia's approach to economic security takes this concept further into workplace protections. In Australia, the minimum wage isn't set by politicians. It's determined annually by an independent body called the Fair Work Commission, which examines economic conditions, inflation, and productivity data. In 2024, they set the national minimum wage at $23.23 Australian dollars per hour, approximately $15 and 35 cents. According to OECD data from 2023, Australia has the second highest minimum wage globally when adjusted for purchasing power. But the wage floor is just the beginning. Every Australian worker is entitled to 4 weeks of paid annual leave. There's no federal requirement for paid vacation in the United States. Parental leave is guaranteed, though advocates argue it should be longer. And here's something Americans rarely see: penalty rates. If you work weekends or public holidays, your employer must pay you 1.5 to 2 times your regular rate. Now, business groups push back. The Australian Chamber of Commerce and Industry regularly argues these costs hurt small businesses and reduce hiring. It's a legitimate economic concern. Higher labor costs do affect business models. But here's what the employment data shows. Australia's small business sector employs 44% of the workforce, similar to the US at 46%. The unemployment rate in 2023 was 3.7%, compared to 3.9% in America. Strong wage floors and worker protections haven't destroyed the job market. What's different? Productivity. Australian workers are among the most productive in the OECD, partly because higher wages attract more committed employees and reduce turnover. When you pay people enough to live on, they stay longer, develop skills, and contribute more. There's also cultural expectation. When worker protections are universal, applying to everyone from CEOs to baristas, they're baked into business planning. Companies don't compete by slashing wages to the minimum. They compete on innovation, service quality, and efficiency. The insight: worker protections can coexist with economic competitiveness when implemented systematically and universally. It's not that Australian businesses are more generous. It's that the regulatory floor is higher, and everyone operates under the same rules. Economic security extends to how societies handle their most vulnerable populations, which brings us to an often overlooked policy area that challenges conventional thinking. In 2001, Sydney opened the Medically Supervised Injecting Centre in King's Cross, an area with high rates of public drug use. It remains Australia's only such facility, though others have been proposed. Here's how it works. People who use illicit drugs can enter, consume their own substances under medical supervision, and access clean equipment. Nurses are present. If someone overdoses, they're treated immediately. No one is arrested for possession of personal use amounts. Over 20 years of data was published in the International Journal of Drug Policy in 2022. The facility has managed more than 6,000 overdoses. The number of deaths at the site? 0. Now let's zoom out. The United States is experiencing a catastrophic opioid epidemic. In 2023, over 100,000 Americans died from drug overdoses. Australia's number was approximately 1,700. Even adjusting for population, Australia has about 26 million people compared to America's 335 million. The per capita difference is significant. Australia hasn't solved addiction. Drug use exists, but the philosophical approach is different. Treat it as a public health issue, not primarily a criminal justice problem. Several Australian states have decriminalized possession of small amounts for personal use. The focus shifts toward treatment access rather than incarceration. The Australian Capital Territory and Northern Territory have implemented cannabis decriminalization. The sky hasn't fallen. Usage rates haven't skyrocketed beyond jurisdictions with harsher penalties. Critics argue this approach enables addiction, that supervised injection sites send the wrong message. These concerns deserve consideration. But here's what the evidence shows. Harm reduction strategies reduce deaths without increasing overall use rates. People struggling with addiction don't stop using because penalties are harsh. They just die in alleys instead of medical facilities. The King's Cross Centre has also connected over 10,000 people with treatment services they wouldn't have accessed otherwise. When you meet people where they are, literally, you can eventually help them reach where they want to be. The takeaway isn't that harm reduction is easy or solves everything. It's that prioritizing survival and treatment access over punishment produces measurable reductions in deaths and creates pathways to recovery that criminalization blocks. This philosophy, collective responsibility even for those making difficult choices, appears in our final example, which might seem mundane but reveals something fundamental about how Australia balances individual convenience with shared protection. In 2015, Johnny Depp and his then-wife Amber Heard brought their dogs into Australia without proper quarantine documentation. Agriculture Minister Barnaby Joyce publicly threatened to euthanize the dogs unless they left within 50 hours. International celebrities. Same rules as everyone else. The dogs were flown out. Heard later received a conviction for providing false immigration documents. This isn't really about celebrity dogs. It's about Australia's biosecurity laws, which are among the strictest on Earth. Australia's Department of Agriculture inspects 100% of international mail and cargo arriving in the country. They stop approximately 50,000 prohibited items annually: fruits, seeds, undeclared food products, wooden items that could harbor insects. Why such extreme measures? Australia is an island nation with unique ecosystems. Many plant and animal species exist nowhere else on the planet. This isolation created extraordinary biodiversity but also extraordinary vulnerability. A single invasive species, a disease, an insect, a plant, can devastate ecosystems that evolved without natural defenses. There are economic stakes too. Australia's agriculture sector is worth $80 billion annually. Foot and mouth disease, which devastated UK livestock in 2001 and South Korea in 2010, has never reached Australian shores. Not because of luck, because of vigilance. The cultural aspect matters here. Australians broadly accept strict biosecurity rules even when they're personally inconvenient. Why? Because the purpose is clear, consistently explained, and universally applied. Wealthy tourists face the same detector dogs and declaration forms as everyone else. This isn't border security in the immigration sense, though that's certainly part of Australia's policy debates. This is environmental protection, agricultural protection, and ecosystem preservation. The collective benefit justifies the individual hassle of declaring that apple in your bag. What this demonstrates: when enforcement is universal and the purpose is transparent, public compliance increases. People accept rules they understand, especially when they see those rules applied equally to everyone. Let's connect these 6 examples and identify the common threads. Gun reform after Port Arthur. Mandatory voting since 1924. Universal health care with private options. Strong workplace protections. Harm reduction for drug policy. Strict biosecurity enforcement. What do they share? Swift action after crises. Bipartisan cooperation on fundamentals. Willingness to accept upfront costs for long-term benefits. Universal application, no exemptions for the wealthy or connected. There are key differences in context. Australia's parliamentary system allows faster legislative response than America's system of divided powers. A smaller population of 26 million enables policy consistency that's harder at U.S. scale. And geographic isolation shapes different threat perceptions. When you're an island, borders mean something different. This isn't presented as Australia is better overall. Each country faces different histories, challenges, and trade-offs. These are specific policy outcomes worth examining, not comprehensive quality of life comparisons. But here's the core insight. Freedom and safety aren't always opposites. Sometimes structural safeguards expand practical freedom by reducing existential fears. If you don't worry about medical bankruptcy, you might start that business. If gun violence is rare, kids play more freely outside. If biosecurity is robust, agriculture thrives. Australia chose collective security mechanisms in these 6 areas. The data shows measurable outcomes. Whether those trade-offs suit your values is for you to decide. We've examined gun policy, voting requirements, healthcare structure, workplace rights, harm reduction, and biosecurity. 6 areas where Australia prioritized collective security with specific results. Here's what I want to know. If you could transplant one of these Australian policies into your own country's context, which would you choose and why? What obstacles would it face and how would you address them? Share your thoughts below. I'm genuinely curious about different perspectives on what's possible and what's desirable. And subscribe for more evidence-based policy comparisons that go beyond headlines and explore what actually works in different contexts. These are complex topics, and understanding them requires looking at data, history, and trade-offs, not just ideological assumptions. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.